What if one of Russia's longest running geopolitical strategies is quietly losing its effectiveness not because of a military defeat, but because the world around it has changed? For decades, frozen conflicts gave Moscow leverage across Eastern Europe. Small territories, unrecognized governments. Russians were stationed just far enough away from international scrutiny to influence neighboring states without triggering a larger war. It was a strategy that appeared remarkably durable. But what if one of those frozen conflicts is no longer serving the purpose it once did? What if the very mechanism designed to preserve Russian influence is slowly becoming a strategic burden instead? Before we continue, if you enjoy in-depth military and geopolitical analysis that goes beyond the headlines, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who follows international affairs. Now let's begin. To understand why Transnistria has returned to the center of geopolitical discussion, we first need to understand what it actually is. Stretching along Moldova's eastern border beside Ukraine, Transnistria occupies only a narrow strip of land. It is not recognized as an independent country by the United Nations. Most maps identify it as part of Moldova. Yet for more than 3 decades, it has operated with many of the institutions normally associated with statehood. It has its own administration, its own security forces, its own currency, its own political institutions. For many observers, it feels like a place where the Soviet terror ever fully disappeared. The origins of this situation date back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As Moldova moved toward independence, political tensions inside the region intensified. Armed conflict followed in the early 1990s. A ceasefire eventually halted the fighting, but it never produced a comprehensive political settlement. Instead, the conflict simply froze. Since then, Russian military personnel have remained in the region under arrangements that Moscow has historically described as peacekeeping and security missions. Whether those arrangements remain politically or legally sustainable has become an increasingly debated question. For years, however, the frozen status itself served an important strategic function. It created uncertainty. It complicated Moldova's long-term security planning, and it ensured that Russia retained influence in a region far beyond its internationally recognized borders. This approach was not unique to Moldova. Throughout the post-Soviet space, unresolved territorial disputes often became geopolitical pressure points. Rather than relying solely on conventional military power, influence could also be maintained through political ambiguity. A conflict that never fully ends can become an enduring source of leverage. For a long time, many analysts believed this model worked remarkably well. But history rarely stands still. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine dramatically altered the strategic environment across Eastern Europe. Countries that once attempted to balance between East and West increasingly began reassessing their long-term security choices. For Moldova, the war next door reinforced concerns about dependence, vulnerability, and national resilience. Rather than slowing European integration, the changing security landscape accelerated political discussions about deeper cooperation with European institutions. That shift is important because geopolitical influence is no longer measured only by troop deployments. It is also measured through economics, energy, infrastructure, trade, institutional partnerships, and long-term political alignment. This broader competition is where Transnistria now takes on new significance. For years, Russia maintained influence in the region through multiple channels. Military presence was only one component. Energy subsidies played another major role. Economic relationships created additional incentives. Political symbolism reinforced the broader narrative. Together, these elements formed a system that appeared relatively stable. But stability often depends on continuous support. When economic conditions change, when regional security changes, and when transportation routes become more complicated, even long-established arrangements begin facing new pressures. One of the most significant realities shaping today's discussion is geography. Unlike Crimea, Transnistria does not share a border with Russia. It sits between Moldova and Ukraine. That geographic reality creates logistical challenges that have become far more important since the war in Ukraine transformed regional transportation corridors. Military forces are only as effective as their ability to receive supplies, personnel maintenance, and communication. Without secure access routes, even established deployments become increasingly difficult to sustain over time. For this reason, many security analysts now describe Transnistria less as an expanding strategic asset and more as an isolated outpost operating under increasingly complex conditions. That does not mean the region suddenly loses all strategic value. Far from it. Its location continues to matter. Its political status continues to matter. Its military presence continues to attract international attention. But the calculations surrounding those factors are evolving. Another development receiving growing attention involves citizenship and identity. For years, many residents of Transnistria have held multiple passports. Some possess Russian documents. Others hold Moldovan citizenship. Many also seek access to opportunities created through closer European integration. These choices are often driven less by ideology than by practical considerations. Travel, employment, education, business opportunities. For individuals living in uncertain political environments, flexibility can become an important personal strategy. Viewed from this perspective, the competition over Transnistria extends far beyond military deployments. It also involves competing visions of economic opportunity and political future. One side emphasizes its historical ties and existing security arrangements. The other highlights institutional integration and access to larger European markets. That competition unfolds gradually. It rarely produces dramatic headlines. Yet over time, incremental political and economic decisions can reshape strategic realities just as profoundly as military operations. This is why many observers argue that Transnistria should no longer be viewed simply as a frozen conflict inherited from the 1990s. Instead, it has become a case study in how modern geopolitical competition increasingly blends military posture, economic incentives, infrastructure, diplomacy, and public expectations into one interconnected strategic landscape. And that raises an even bigger question. If traditional tools of influence become harder to sustain, what replaces them? Because the answer to that question may shape not only Moldova's future, but also Russia's broader position across Eastern Europe. And that is where the story becomes even more interesting. So where does this leave Russia? That is the question increasingly occupying policymakers, military planners, and regional analysts alike. For decades, maintaining influence over Transnistria relied on a familiar formula. Maintain a limited military presence. Support the local economy through energy and financial assistance. Preserve political uncertainty. And prevent Moldova from fully escaping Russia's sphere of influence. But strategies that work under one geopolitical environment do not always survive another. The war in Ukraine fundamentally reshaped Europe's security calculations. What had once been viewed as manageable regional disputes are now increasingly seen through the broader lens of continental security. As a result, Moldova's relationship with European institutions has gained new momentum. Investment programs have expanded. Infrastructure projects have accelerated. Energy diversification has become a national priority. Instead of relying primarily on a single external supplier, Moldova has worked to develop alternative connections with European energy markets. From a strategic perspective, this matters because dependence has always been one of the most effective forms of geopolitical leverage. Reducing that dependence changes the balance without firing a single shot. The same principle applies economically. For years, Transnistria benefited from preferential arrangements that helped sustain its industrial base and local administration. But prolonged regional instability, changing trade patterns, and the wider economic consequences of war have complicated that model. Businesses prefer predictable markets. Investors seek legal certainty. Young professionals pursue opportunities where long-term growth appears stronger. Those forces are difficult to reverse through political messaging alone. Perhaps the most overlooked element of this story is demographics. Across much of Eastern Europe, younger generations increasingly evaluate their future through economic opportunity rather than historical identity. Access to education, employment, freedom of movement, digital connectivity. These factors often influence personal decisions more than geopolitical narratives. That does not mean history becomes irrelevant. It simply means priorities evolve. For many families, practical concerns eventually outweigh symbolic politics. This gradual shift may prove just as consequential as any diplomatic negotiation. History offers many examples where prolonged territorial disputes did not end through decisive military campaigns. Instead, they slowly lost momentum as economic realities changed. Communities became more connected to surrounding markets. Younger generations developed different expectations. Political structures that once appeared permanent gradually became harder to sustain. No two conflicts are identical. Transnistria has its own unique history, legal complexities, and security considerations. Its future remains uncertain. But one lesson appears increasingly relevant. Influence today is measured by far more than military deployments. Modern competition increasingly revolves around infrastructure, energy security, financial integration, technology, supply chains, and institutional credibility. These forms of influence often develop quietly over years rather than appearing overnight. For Russia, this creates a difficult strategic equation. Maintaining an isolated military presence requires political attention, logistical support, and economic resources. At the same time, Moscow continues to face significant commitments elsewhere. Every additional obligation forces difficult choices about priorities. That does not necessarily imply an immediate policy change. Major powers rarely abandon long-standing positions quickly, but it does increase the cost of maintaining them. Meanwhile, Moldova continues pursuing a different strategy. Rather than attempting to alter the regional balance through military means, it has emphasized institutional reform, economic integration, and closer cooperation with European partners. Whether that path ultimately succeeds remains uncertain. European integration is a long process. It requires legal reforms, economic modernization, political consensus, and sustained public support. None of those developments happen overnight. Yet momentum itself can become strategically important. When investors believe a country is becoming more stable, investment follows. When businesses expect regulatory improvements, trade expands. When institutions strengthen, international partnerships deepen. These gradual changes can reshape the strategic landscape just as effectively as traditional military power. That broader lesson extends far beyond Moldova. Across international politics, influence is increasingly determined by resilience rather than coercion alone. Countries compete through technology, infrastructure, capital investment, energy diversification, suburcusurdia, industrial capacity, and diplomatic partnerships. Military strength remains essential, but it is no longer the only measure of national power. In many cases, economic endurance and institutional credibility determine who ultimately gains the strategic advantage. This is why Transnistria represents more than a local dispute. It reflects a larger transition in the way geopolitical competition is unfolding across Europe. One model relies primarily on maintaining influence through security arrangements established decades ago. The other emphasizes long-term integration into broader political and economic networks. Those two approaches now coexist along one narrow strip of territory. Neither side has achieved a definitive outcome, and that uncertainty is likely to persist for years. Yet the direction of travel may prove just as important as today's snapshot. The central question is no longer simply who controls territory. It is who shapes the future expectations of the people living there. History repeatedly demonstrates that borders matter. Military power matters. Security guarantees matter. But so do opportunity, prosperity, and confidence in tomorrow. People rarely make life decisions based only on geopolitics. They also choose according to jobs, education, mobility, and economic stability. Those individual choices, repeated thousands of times over many years, can gradually reshape entire regions. That is why many analysts now describe Transnistria less as an isolated frozen conflict and more as part of a broader contest over Europe's future security architecture. It is no longer simply about one disputed territory. It is about competing visions of regional order. One built on strategic ambiguity, the other built on institutional integration. Which approach ultimately proves more durable remains an open question. And that is precisely why this story deserves attention. Because the outcome will not necessarily be decided by a single battle or one dramatic political announcement. It may instead emerge through years of gradual economic change, diplomatic engagement, and shifting public expectations. Sometimes history changes suddenly. Other times it changes so slowly that few people recognize it until the balance has already shifted. Transnistria may become one of those places where the most significant developments occur quietly through policy, economics, infrastructure, and the everyday decisions of ordinary people. Whether that gradual transformation ultimately reshapes Eastern Europe's strategic landscape is something the coming years will reveal. But one thing is already clear. The geopolitical environment that created the frozen conflicts of the 1990s is no longer the same environment that exists today. And every major power operating in the region must now adapt to a very different strategic reality. If you enjoyed this analysis, let me know what you think. Can frozen conflicts remain effective geopolitical tools in the 21st century? Or are economics, institutions, and long-term integration becoming the decisive factors that shape regional influence? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy strategic military and geopolitical analysis that looks beyond the daily headlines, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.